This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Dalia Shendlin, my partner in crime, is away this week and will be back soon. But every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. My guest today is senior researcher and director of exhibitions at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. He is the author of a new book entitled Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Stories from the Yiddish Press, which focuses on the two capitals of Yiddish culture in the 1920s and 30s, Warsaw and New York. The book is as fun to read as the title may suggest, and it was published very recently by Stanford University Press. Dr. Eddy Portnoy, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's become almost a cliche to say that the press is the first draft of history. Is that how you treated the papers that served as the basis for the book? Did you try to recreate a social and cultural reality that is now long gone?
I did, although one of the unusual things here, as far as the first draft of history goes, is that what I wanted to do with this book is bring out aspects of Jewish history that hadn't been included. So this is literally the first draft, at least in English. You know, during my dissertation research, I began to come across material in the Yiddish Press that was extremely engaging, was a window on a variety of aspects of Jewish life that I hadn't seen before in historiography, and I was really taken with them. And so I wasted an enormous amount of time during my dissertation research just photocopying odd stories I found here and there in Yiddish newspapers. And I accumulated an enormous amount. I have boxes and boxes of photocopies. Now you can digitize them, but this was from the time when you had to make a photocopy. And my wife would love for me to get rid of these materials, which crowd up our
Are still there?
Yeah.
Right. So how did you arrange the process in the first place? I mean, as you said, there are boxes upon boxes. I'm sure there were many more stories that could have ended up in the book. How did you prioritize? How do you sift through this enormous amount of material?
Right. Well, it's true that the material is endless. You could spend lifetimes in old Yiddish newspapers, not just from New York and Warsaw, but from really the rest of the planet, discovering incredibly odd stories that, no one has ever heard of before. And so what I did was I found some of this material in a variety of different ways. But when I would find something, if I found a story that, like, for instance, had legs, if it was written about in multiple issues, if it was a larger story. Some of the stories are very small. They, it appears in one issue and that's all you have. But others are continuous and they go on for weeks and weeks and sometimes, more than that. And so those tended to be bigger stories, and I discovered a number of them. I think the vast majority of stories that I found were shorter and are sort of just little capsules of Yiddish oddity that, you wouldn't find elsewhere. But what would really happen is I would be working at the Center for Jewish History, where YIVO is located, and I would spend my mornings and afternoons looking at microfilm. I would go to lunch with a friend or colleague, and I'd say, you're not going to believe what I found in the newspaper this morning. And I'd tell them the story. And at some point, someone said, you should really just write these up because, they're amazing.
Yeah, and they're just sitting there in the archive.
Right. And so I initially started writing them up for Tablet magazine. I published a few in there, and there were some longer stories that I published in a defunct magazine called Guilt and Pleasure that existed, I think, maybe from 2004 to 2006. It was actually quite good, but the
name sounds ominous.
Yeah, yeah, it was excellent. It was very well done, but published some of these things there, and they tended to be the longer ones. They were more of a long form type of writing, and one of them was something that I didn't really discover during my research. I was working in the Jewish Theological Seminary library, and I had a friend who worked in the rare book room. And he came to me one day with an old Yiddish newspaper, and he didn't know Yiddish. And he said, I found this on the shelf. It's not cataloged, and it's I don't know what it is. Can you date this for me? There was no date on the newspaper. And so he gives me this newspaper. It's on linen, and it's handwritten and lithographed, which is very unusual in the world of the Yiddish press. And so because of the nature of the paper, I thought it's got to be 1870s or 1880s, and which is old for, it was an American paper, which makes it somewhat unique.
Yeah.
So
Because it was before there was a critical mass of Yiddish speakers in America. Right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the story turned out to be about the murder trial of a Jewish immigrant by the name of Pesach Rubenstein. And the whole issue of the paper was about him and his travail. So I read this, and I've never heard of Pesach Rubenstein. So I go to the American Jewish History section of the library, and I just start pulling books off shelves, looking in the indexes for Pesach Rubenstein or other names that were relevant to the trial. And I pretty much came up empty. I did find 3 books that mentioned this trial. One of them had 2 sentences about it. One of them had a paragraph, and then one of them, which was Alter Landsman's History of Brownsville, Brooklyn, had a page and a half. And I looked through the indexes of about 50 books, and I was, I thought, this must not have been terribly important. Then I went to an online database of American historical newspapers. It has American newspapers from, I think, the sort of mid-17th century to 1922. And I put in the name Pesach Rubenstein, and I got over 900 hits. And I was stunned because in Jewish historiography, there was virtually nothing.
Yeah.
Yet in American newspapers, I was deluged with information. And so I started looking at these articles, and what I discovered was virtually every newspaper in the United States at the time wrote about this. And it appears not just in the New York papers extensively, but blurbs about it appear in far-flung places in Idaho and Mississippi, and all. It was just a popular story. So I thought, wow, there's a disconnect here. This is really odd. So I began to research this story, and I looked at all these articles. I developed the story, and what I found was that it was enormously important. In fact, it was the largest interface between Jews and the American media in the history of the country up until that point.
Wow.
And I wound up finding things like, and the trial takes place in 1876. And I wound up finding things like, I came across an anthology of popular songs from the 1870s. And there was a song in it called My Name is Pesach Rubenstein, which completely blew my mind. It was, a popular song. Also, there's this really very interesting American journalistic phenomenon called murder pamphlets. Murder pamphlets were created for big murder trials. They were 8 to 16-page illustrated pamphlets that were somewhat sensationalistic and described, murders and their subsequent trials in sort of simple language for common readers. And it was sort of a precursor to pulp literature. And typically for big murder trials, you'd have 1, maybe 2 pamphlets produced for a trial. And what I discovered, 4 of them were created for the Pesach Rubenstein trial, and the entire trial transcript was published as a book just for popular consumption in the wake of the trial. And so I was completely amazed. And it was just by dint of the fact that this friend of mine brought me this newspaper and said, "What is this?" And I, wound up writing about it. I found that no one wrote about it. And I thought this is somehow very important.
So what is really the added value of dipping into Yiddish journalism? Because Pesach Rubenstein is just an example, but it was covered in the general press as well. There are other, of course it's a difference of scale, of course. The readership of the Yiddish press were people who were, of course, more interested in such cases as Pesach Rubenstein's than others. But do you feel that it was a different kind of reportage, different kind of journalism, a different kind of, literary construction of the events?
Sure. So one of the values of dipping into Yiddish is that you get different aspects of the story. And what's fascinating here is the American English language Jewish press of the period did its best to ignore this story. So papers like the American Israelite, would have a few sentences about the Pesach Rubenstein debacle, just to let people know, because it was a Reform Jewish newspaper. It also mentioned something like, if I recall correctly, it's of note that Rubenstein's orthodoxy was no impediment to his ability to commit crime. So they got to dig in there, but they published virtually nothing. The English language Jewish papers published virtually nothing. Whereas the Yiddish press, which at the time was very much like a private conversation, published freely and had no compunction about saying everything.
Because they didn't care what the goyim would say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gentiles couldn't read Yiddish. Obviously, there's a great history of Gentiles who could speak Yiddish because they interacted with Jews, but it was extremely rare that they could read Yiddish. So it was, like I said, very much a private conversation.
So do you think that there are noticeable traits of Yiddish journalism, the same that there are this Jewish humor?
I think so. What's interesting about Yiddish journalism as it progresses, and in particular in places like Warsaw, you wind up with a type of humor and snark that you don't really have in other newspapers. In particular, one of the odd things about the Yiddish press, and this has been written about elsewhere, but there was a tendency to hitch humor onto real-life tragedy and crime stories. Reporters wrote about crime as, what they would call the victims and the perpetrators by diminutives. What would happen is, if, for instance, this is just a hypothetical, this isn't a real story, but if you had someone named, Mottel Bernstein, who committed theft, they would mention his name, Mottel Bernstein, perpetrated such and such a theft. And then they would begin calling him Mottele. And Mottele got caught by the police. It's, that doesn't happen elsewhere.
Yeah,
It's very unusual.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting that you take these two centers of Yiddish journalism that, of course, the historical and political context in which they emerged were completely different. The old world, the Yiddish land, and the new world. Both cities, by the way, and that is I learned thanks to your book, had an enormous proportion of Jews in the 1920s and 30s. A fourth of the population of New York was Jewish, and a third of the population of Warsaw in the 20s and 30s were Jews, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
Do you see the two as complementary? Now with the benefit of hindsight as a historian, you're looking back on these two and also trying to arrange them systematically.
Yeah, they're certainly complementary. In fact, and one of the interesting aspects to this as far as the journalism goes is that Yiddish journalism got its start in New York before it did in Warsaw. Yiddish journalism begins in New York in the 1870s and doesn't really get going until the mid 1880s, after there's a real critical mass of Yiddish readers there. In Warsaw and in Eastern Europe as a whole, which was generally ruled by the Russian Empire, Yiddish journalism was restricted and censored, and they allowed very few newspapers. There were only, during the 19th century, in the Pale of Settlement, for example, there were only 2 weekly Yiddish newspapers permitted. So because the United States didn't have, those restrictions, it was able to develop freely. It only required money. But one of the interesting things is that Yiddish journalism in New York very much influences Yiddish journalism in Warsaw. They see people, and these papers get sent back and forth across the ocean, and people in Warsaw see the newspapers in New York, and I think they're probably impressed by what they see. It may not be the Yiddish they speak or possibly the best quality Yiddish, but it's a very functional type of journalism that hadn't really existed there and wouldn't exist until after the failed Russian Revolution.
But the realities themselves that these papers cover, do you see them as parallel, or is there any? I'm trying to understand how different the Yiddish culture, Yiddish society that were the objects of coverage.
Right.
How different were they?
There are obvious differences. These are two very different places, but you also have to keep in mind that the Jews in New York are, almost all immigrants. And the children,
newcomers.
Yeah. And they come from this place. So so there's great familiarity with it. However, the American Yiddish Press was very much influenced by the American press. They saw what was going on in their industry around them, and they copy it. They also have some of their own innovations. But, some of the things – and, at some point – the Warsaw Yiddish Press does similar things, but, you could take one example of one of the more popular columns in the Vorwärts, which was a Bintelbrief, a bundle of letters, which was sort of the agony aunt advice column that was, which was incredibly popular in this newspaper. That something like that didn't really exist in Warsaw. How do
you explain it? Do you have a theory?
The American Yiddish papers had this as well. It was a phenomenon of people being able to walk into the offices of the papers and complain about something or ask a question or ask for advice. The Warsaw papers actually had a bureau that was, and I'm speaking about Heint and Moment, which were the two major Yiddish newspapers during, from just before World War I through 1939. These two papers both had bureaus that were open to the public at certain times of the day where people could come in and tell their stories. That in turn, some of those stories at least would become articles. They didn't take the format of the Bintelbrief, this agony aunt column. Journalists would sort of just write them up. Such and such a person from this neighborhood complained about the local butcher selling pork. There are a variety of problems that people run into in these places that, that receive complaints in whatever precinct.
Yeah. There's always the risk, bearing in mind how that reality ended. In Europe, it ended very tragically. In America, it was, the kind embrace of America killed it softly. And also, many Jews look back on the heyday of Yiddish with nostalgia, the Fiddler on the Rooftop type nostalgia. How do you refrain from falling into that trap?
Well, there are really two aspects to this. The nostalgic aspect, it's easy to avoid because once you get involved with history, you see everything. And the only way you're going to write about nostalgia is if you're writing about the phenomenon. It's not something that interests most historians.
Doesn't it? How can you not fall in love with those quirky people that you read about?
Yeah, I'll admit that I'd like them very much.
Yeah.
I may not want to meet many of them.
No, probably not, but it's just great to read and write about them.
Right, they're very compelling.
Yeah.
The other aspect of this is, of what to avoid is one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was because the general historiography surrounding Yiddish culture and Eastern European Jewish culture is a heavily intellectualized history. It's about rabbis and scholars and writers and poets and artists, scientists, figures who, historical figures who are of great significance, who leave massive paper trails for historians to dig into, which is what most historians do. And when I was in graduate school, I found that all of my colleagues were doing this. And I decided to take I don't know if it was because of a contrarian sensibility, but I decided to take a slightly different tack. And my dissertation was on cartoons of the Yiddish press. It was something that I looked at and thought was very, it was just a fascinating mirror on Jewish society of the period. And it's very much through those cartoons that I discovered a lot of these stories. And as far as the historiography goes, what I was finding was that the historiography of the common man, to a large degree, was missing. There's a lot of discussion of it. For instance, every Eastern European Jewish historian worth his salt will mention, Shimon Dubnov's, letter of early 1890s, in which he mentions, we must study the common man, of Eastern Europe, the common Jews of Eastern Europe. It ends up that not very many people do that. And so as a result, within the historiography, you don't find a great deal about, average people of, the common Jews who, the Jewish masses who live these lives.
And how do you think it will enrich the study of Yiddish culture and not just remain this fun catalogue of quirky pieces that do not add up to more than their parts, the sum of the parts? Right.
Well, one of the things I'm hoping is that my colleagues, graduate students, will see this material and say, there's an enormous amount here. There's mention of all kinds of different types of people. You have circus performers, you have gays and lesbians, you have drug addicts, you have, average people in sometimes difficult and unusual situations that, just haven't been explored.
And what about the style itself, or the study of Yiddish literature? You quote Israel Joshua Singer, the brother of Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was Yiddish journalist himself, apparently even more popular than his brother.
That's true.
At some point.
In their time.
Yeah, which I didn't know. That's very interesting. Who said that good journalism is also good literature. And that's, a kind of a truism. But do you think that Yiddish lends itself in a more comfortable way to this truism?
Absolutely. There is, first of all Yiddish writers at some point were also journalists. And a lot of their writing in the daily newspapers is phenomenal. In particular, I.J. Singer, his stories fill, the Warsaw and the New York. He was the Polish correspondent for the Vorwärts, and his stories fill, these papers, and they're incredibly well written, and they shed light on, all kinds of aspects of Jewish life in Poland and in Eastern Europe that you wouldn't have otherwise. And in addition to him, you have all kinds of Yiddish writers whose work is phenomenal. There is also, journalism that's not so well written. These are people who are putting out, if you've written for a daily newspaper, it's not that easy to put out quality
so-called
work.
Journalists,
right? That phenomenon exists as well, and it's inevitable. But there is a huge amount of quality material in Yiddish newspapers, and you just have to live with the tedium of microfilm, or now in some cases you can go online.
Yeah, sure.
But,
do you think that, as we said, in Europe, of course, it ended with this great tragedy, and in America, not so much, but it's still no longer there. But, it wasn't eradicated or exterminated in a violent way. It just morphed into something new, a new kind of Jewish American culture. Do you see that experience, that cultural experience replicated in more modern Jewish American journalism? I
would say not as much. I think that the American Jewish press is pretty different than the Yiddish press was. I mean, there are still some Yiddish newspapers. The Vorwärts still publishes, monthly now. Mm-hmm. But the language is different. To return to what I said before about the Yiddish press being a private conversation, that doesn't exist in English. Everyone sees what you do, and people, I think, are more circumspect when they write because of that. They're not apt to, just say whatever they want, within the privacy of their own linguistic bubble.
I'd like to ask you, before we wrap up, to choose one story in the book that's your favorite one, and to give our listeners a taste of it.
Wow, that's hard to do because
you love all your children just the same.
The stories are. I mean, I will say that one of the stories I like the most is the Miss Judea story. I don't want to take up too much time because it's somewhat of a complicated tale, but it's the story of a Jewish beauty pageant that takes place in Warsaw in 1929. It's a pageant that's sponsored by a Polish language Jewish newspaper called Nasz Przegląd. And it's really something to do on one hand to create better circulation for the paper, to sell more papers. And on the other hand, they understood that a Jewish woman would never win the Miss Poland pageants. So they decided to create a Jewish beauty pageant, and they called it the Miss Judea pageant. Mm-hmm. So in the wake of the pageant, which was held in a gala runoff at the Hotel Polonia, with bands and guests, and it was a very big event, they brought the winner, a woman by the name of Sofia Oldak. The editor schlepped her around to all the different cultural institutions in Warsaw. It was essentially for photo opportunities. They, brought her to a variety of different Polish Jewish politicians and photographed her with them. They brought her to be photographed with, famous actors in the Yiddish theater, with Yiddish, well-known Yiddish writers. And she became a sort of local celebrity. And the president of the Kehila, or the Warsaw Jewish Community Council, which was a sort of quasi-governmental agency to which Jews paid taxes and to which they elected representatives, it was a very important institution. The president, which is a man by the name of Heschel Farbstein, he was also the president of the Mizrahi Religious Zionist Party. he invited her to the Kehillah building for a banquet. And, he invited whatever other politicians and his colleagues he wanted to invite. He got up and praised her beauty and sang her Song of Songs, which is, if you've read Song of Songs, it's sort of like this erotic poem that was smuggled into the Bible somehow. And, that went off fine. However, the following day, when the members of the Kehillah belonging to the Agudas Yisrael or Agudat Yisrael found out about this, they were infuriated. They claimed that he, desecrated Song of Songs, that he desecrated the name of the Kehillah, that he's got to resign. And they immediately brought all their yeshiva students out of their yeshivas to protest in front of the Kehillah. And this, to Israelis, I think this is something they can relate to. And when the newspaper that created the pageant found out about this, they set up groups of secular Jews to protest on the other side of the street in front of the Kehillah. On one side of the street, you had secular Jews protesting, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who were on the other side of the street protesting the president of the Kehillah. In the middle, you had Polish policemen who sort of had no idea what was going on. This was sort of a small convulsion within the fabric of Warsaw Jewish life. And after about a week, the mutual recriminations died down. But the president of the Agudas Yisrael party passed away, unrelated to any of this.
Who knows?
Yeah. Okay, possibly related to this. Yeshaya Rosenboy was his name, and he died, and he was not only the president of Agudas Yisrael, but he was a Hasidic Rebbe of significance, and as a result, he was to be buried in a very massive Hasidic funeral to which 10 to 15,000 mourners would attend. Now, Heschel Farbstein, the man who had been protested the previous week by Agudas Yisrael, had to give a eulogy in the name of the community, in the name of the Kehillah, and at this funeral. And so he went, he understood that there was some conflict, and he went to the man's family and asked if he could have permission to speak. They said, absolutely. This is not a political event. It's a funeral. He was your colleague. Please give a eulogy in the name of the community. So he arrives, and a dais has been built. And he mounts the dais, and all of the yeshiva students who had been protesting him the week previous in front of the Kehillah building see him and explode with rage and start stamping their feet and screaming, "Miss Judea, Miss Judea, Miss Judea." And he realizes that this is not going to work, and he is hustled out of the cemetery to boisterous applause. The yeshiva students who were yelling continued to yell. They were reprimanded by the rabbis on the dais and by older adults among the mourners. They wouldn't stop. Pushing and shoving started. Fights broke out. And as it happened, this funeral took place at the end of the day, and you're not supposed to bury a body after sundown. So they started to lower the body into the grave as people were fighting and screaming around it, and people smashed the dais to get blocks of wood to beat people with, and all of this occurred during, the funeral of this very esteemed Hasidic Rebbe, and it was a scandal of, great enormity that, plunged Jewish Warsaw into great shame. Now, Shmuel Yatzkan, who was the founder and former editor of Heinz, which is the largest Polish Jewish newspaper, or Polish Yiddish newspaper, wrote in the wake of all this that this was one of the greatest events in the history of Polish Jewry because, amid the unemployment and the taxes and the suicides and the tragedies and the anti-Semitism of Polish Jewry, they had a great opportunity to laugh at themselves. And, this is an event that, I discovered because I saw cartoons about it.
It wasn't covered in the non-Jewish press.
There were in the Polish Jewish, I'm sorry, not Jewish, but the Polish press articles. Some articles did appear about it, but really nowhere else. It was a almost a purely Yiddish phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's something, it was a scandal that engulfed all precincts of Jewish Warsaw, from the Hasidim to the religious Zionists to the secular to Polish-speaking Jews. It threw all of them together in this incredible explosion. And it's just It's so compelling. It's just a fascinating story.
I'm sure that there's enough in there for a few more books like that. Not only non-fiction books like that, but I'm sure it gave you plenty of ideas for fiction books, as it did to the journalists themselves who ended up being writers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you read Yiddish literature from the 20s and 30s, you will find many echoes of these stories, in popular literature of the period. There's no question. Can I mention one thing?
Sure.
This book is in the process of being translated into Hebrew.
Oh, brilliant.
By a woman whose name is Julia Fermento, who's an Israeli novelist who just came out with a novel called Kfar Saba Alpaim. And so I'm hoping that within a short time it'll be available to Hebrew speakers.
Thanks very much for that. And once again, thank you, Eddy Portnoy, for appearing on the show. You're a senior researcher and director of exhibitions at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York and the author of Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Stories from the Yiddish Press. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to our producer, Itai Shelem, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on to our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks and plenty other stuff for you. Check out our archive. It has almost 500 interviews to keep you busy, entertained and annoyed. If you like what we do here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And do not forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.